he doesn't have the manpower quickly available. They're sending conscripts, which of course is causing a certain reaction inside Russia, a very unfavorable reaction. And I think Putin is both furious and embarrassed. Furious with his own generals and chiefs of staff who haven't prepared for this, who haven't secured the borders, and embarrassed because it does look as though Russia is vulnerable, something that he's always said Russia is secure and firm and can, look after its own defense. And that clearly doesn't seem to be the message that's come out.
And in terms of the choices he's now faced with, I mean, all of them carry political problems. He can divert troops from the front line in the east of Ukraine, but clearly that's not ideal. He can use conscripts, but again, that comes with political costs. Or he could launch a fresh wave of mobilisation, but again, politically very risky.
Exactly. You said exactly the three things that are very difficult for him, and those are really the only three options. His favoured response would be a massive military counterstrike to really hit the Ukrainians hard and push them straight out again. That's probably what the Ukrainians themselves have been expecting, and they're probably ready to withdraw quickly if needed, partly to save their own manpower and partly to secure their position as a force that could strike back but are not there to occupy territory but to show the Russians that they're vulnerable. But the other one, as you say, conscripts, well, they are already, it seems, sending some conscripts into the region, and that's caused a massive reaction. The mothers of Russia, who up to now have been surprisingly quiet, have begun to say, look, this is not what we were told. Our sons and our young ones are not there to be on the front line, and this is the front line. Well, it is now. And the final thing, which is to bang the patriotic drum and get everyone gang together, doesn't seem to be working because there's a lot of surprisingly open criticism in the Russian media of this blunder, the fact that Russia was unprepared, they didn't see it coming, and that they haven't really had proper border reinforcements.
It's easy to be wise after the event, because if you told either of us 3 weeks ago, oh, by the way, Ukraine's about to invade Russia, we probably would have, discounted it. But should the Russians, in hindsight, have seen this coming? Should they have expected this could happen?
Probably not, because they felt the Ukrainians were on the back foot, and to some extent they still are. They just don't seem able to have the manpower or the resources, and in particular the weapons, to stop the steady thrust by Russia across this big, broad front all along eastern Ukraine. And the Ukrainians, little by little, have been ceding ground, have been giving up villages, have lost strong points. And the Russians, I think, felt that they've got Ukraine on the run. Maybe not straight away, and maybe there are some setbacks, but in the end, the inevitable result is that Ukraine will be pushed further and further back from the front line. What they didn't anticipate is that Ukraine would be able to gather together and mobilize a strike force which would be diverted to some region not where the Russians are pushing forward, but up north, further north in the Kursk region, and that they would suddenly spring on a surprise on the Russians, which is exactly what they have done. And I think, yes, of course, they will be blamed for bad intelligence, bad defense, but to be fair to them, I don't think they could have seen this coming.
You made a really interesting point a moment ago, Michael, about some of the reaction inside Russia, including in the Russian media, that, of course, is so controlled by the Kremlin to a large extent, but has been critical in recent weeks. To what extent will people inside Russia even be aware of the full extent of what's happening in the Kursk region? I mean, clearly it is an informational autocracy. If you're living in Kursk, if you're living in Belgorod Oblast, which has been evacuated, you'll be aware of it. But if you're an ordinary Russian in Moscow, St. Petersburg, or one of the other cities or towns, how aware are you?
Well, not very aware officially, because, as you say, there's been a clampdown, and Putin himself has barely commented on this at all. He's been invisible, except that he's done a few walkabouts just recently. And as somebody remarked, only when Putin is under pressure does he go on walkabouts and try to show himself as a real leader, liked by the people, popular, shaking hands, all that sort of thing. Normally he's much more remote, much more secluded, and he hasn't really said much about this. Possibly a sign of embarrassment because he doesn't quite know what he should say. But the fact that there has been a sort of information blackout, it's not a complete blackout, but it's certainly not much detail of what the Ukrainians have gained in the region. that can be undermined by all these people who've fled, who all have relatives all over Russia, or probably many of them do, and word has got back by word of mouth, which is the normal way. People have said, do you know what's happening down there? Let me tell you, my uncle has just told me this and this and this, or whatever it is, and word spreads pretty quickly. So I think a lot of Russians are quite aware of exactly the danger that they've now face and the problem of having lost territory for the first time since the Second World War.
Which is a huge humiliation. I mean, it does seem not like a deliberate tactic now by the Ukrainians to bring the war quite literally to Russia, not only in terms of this incursion, but also the drone attacks that we've seen on Moscow, and also the fact, you've got Telegram down, you've got WhatsApp down. If you're living in Russia, it's becoming more apparent that all is not well.
I think that's absolutely clear, yes. I mean, the drone attacks on Moscow probably don't inflict much damage. It's clearly demoralizing to think that from far away, from, 1,000 miles away or whatever it is, they are still able to send something over to cause damage in the capital, which up till now has felt pretty safe. I mean, there have been one or two sporadic attacks up till now. I think that's probably, in terms of Ukrainian tactics, a little bit dubious. It will certainly cause doubts among Ukraine's Western supporters. They've told the Ukrainians, look, we're not here to back an all-out war. We don't want you targeting Moscow or any other big population centers. We are ready to go along with strikes on Russian military establishments, particularly in the border regions, which have happened and where they've used drones to some good effect. But I think the drone attacks, well, they're intended not really to cause damage, but to demoralize Russia and to embarrass the Russian leadership, and they probably have done that. But I think much more the embarrassment is losing territory. I mean, that is the real key thing. That's never happened before, and that certainly is something that the Russians will feel both angry about and probably ashamed.
We've spoken about Putin being pretty paralysed at the moment, but what do you think he will decide to do in the end, Michael?
I think if possible, he would decide on a massive military counterstrike. I think he will be preparing a force that will go straight in enormous numbers and with overwhelming force and weapons. And at the same time, he will probably prepare a huge drone or missile or bombing attack on big cities in Ukraine. I mean, Kharkiv has already been under attack. Kiev comes under regular attack, but I think these will be redoubled, and he will go for the infrastructure, which they've been doing already, trying to knock out all their energy networks and things of that kind. And it will really, the aim is to make it as difficult and uncomfortable for Ukraine as possible, and if possible, cut off their lines of communication to the Kursk region.